Okay, everybody, hi. Welcome to another session of Control+M Presents. We're so happy that you've joined us. It's been a busy year for us so far. It's only February, and we've already brought 5 new companies live on Plex, which is pretty amazing, but we're never too busy to keep sharing our Plex knowledge with the community. As a reminder to everybody here, we're recording this session, so you're all on mute. When question time comes around at the end of the presentation, you'll need to remember to unmute yourself to ask the question. Okay, on to today's topic. Today, our Justyna Walker, who actually was on site for 2 of the go lives this year, will be talking about how you can get Plex by Rockwell Automation to automatically create supplier PO releases using MRP. This is a great little bit of functionality that, when handled properly, can save you quite a bit of time. Justyna joined Control+M back in 2020 when we started up our Canadian office, and since then she's been an amazing resource for our team. We're so grateful you're here, Justyna. So, without any further ado, take it away.
Some technical difficulties there. I apologize. Thank you, Patty, and hello, everyone. Welcome to Control+M Presents Automatic Supplier PO Release Creation. As Patty already mentioned, the session today is being recorded and it's going to be added to our YouTube channel by the end of next week. If you are joining us today, chances are that you are familiar with MRP and already utilize it. Plex has a way to automate the process for you. Plex calls it Automatic Supplier PO Release Creation, which is a mouthful, so I like to call it Auto MRP. Plex also has Auto PRP, where it auto creates jobs for you. However, I'll leave those details for another session. On our agenda today, we are going to cover the required setup. We'll jump into Plex and review the process. And lastly, I'll review a series of considerations such as potential impacts, best practices, and recommendations. Over the next few slides, I list a series of settings that are required or needed to be considered when setting up Auto MRP. I have listed some here with a brief description for you to reference during your testing. I will not go into detail on these ones, as most of these are simple turn on or off or set to 1 or 2 type of settings. The more complex ones I'll cover over the next few slides. Okay, in the picture, in this picture, I show the impact the recommendation days, weeks, months display settings. So those are 3 separate settings. And the impact they have on the MRP recommendation screen. I have set all 3 of these particular settings to 3 so the results may fit onto one screen and provide a better visual. However, once we jump into Plex, the setup is a bit more realistic, which I will also review with you. You can see in this picture here that the day section shows the due date column, they're 1 day apart. Then it jumps to week apart, and then finally month apart. Considering our setup on the previous slide where everything was set to 3, I set the firm days setting to 3 and planned day setting to 21. Why 21? Because if you recall in the previous slide, I said that after my 3 days of daily buckets, I wanted to switch to 3 weeks of weekly buckets, and 21 days equals 3 weeks. Of course, you may choose to show your planned in daily buckets. However, best practice is daily to be firm, weekly to be planned, monthly to be forecast. There are really only a couple of setup tables to consider, which you probably already have configured. However, here are the minimum requirements for those. In the PO release setup status, in the PO release status setup table, the one, include an MRP flag must be on for a release to be considered in the MRP calculation. You must have a default status. You must have a canceled status. One status must be set up with the plan status flag on, and only statuses with the MRP auto change flag on will be used in the automatic release creation process. In the purchase order type screen, you must have a PO type with the purchase components flag on in the receiving section, as this will be used for releases that will be automatically created. Okay, now let's jump into Plex. So I'm going to stop sharing this and I'll jump into Plex. Okay. A couple of things to review. So one of the settings that I had to turn on is on the part level was the release auto create. So I went into my part. This is the part that I will be purchasing. And on the part, I did turn on the release auto create. For this part in my process routing, so we received this part and my supplier is Metals USA. So now jumping into my suppliers, I'm in the supplier detail for Metals USA. And this supplier too has the release auto create flag. So I'll just go ahead and turn that on. Perfect. And then the other thing that I did for preparation for this, I already created a PO for Metals USA. It's my purchase components, which has the receiving flag on. So it is in a status of on order. And here's my part for it. I have no releases for it. Okay. Now in MRP, going to manually generate MRP. In test, you can test it by manually generating MRP. In live, it's the nightly generate that will do this. So while that is running, so it's in process right now, I'm going to jump into the recommendation screen and talk about slides 4 and 5 to kind of show you a little bit more of a realistic view instead of the 3, 3, and 3. So here in my recommendation screen, you see my due date and see how they're a day apart. And then it jumps to weekly bucket, 7 days apart. And then it jumps to monthly bucket. So this is from slide 4. And then slide 5, I paired it with slide 5, where I said, okay, for my dailies, I want to link those to my firms. So my dailies are officially my firms. Then where I jump to weeklies, I match those with planned because I only did 4 weeks of planned. So I did 7 firms, 4 weeks of planned, and then the remainder, my monthlies, are my forecast. So this is the slides 4 and 5 that I talked about. Okay, let's go back and see if my MRP is done. Perfect. We're done, and we see we've got releases out there. I'm going to go back in. And here is my on orders. So I've got my firms, then jump to planned, and finally forecast. And if I go into the PO that I had created, I'm just going to go straight to the line item. Remember, I had no releases in there before. And here's the matching releases to the recommendation screen. So here's my 2 firms. There's my 4 planned. and the remainder of my forecast. Again, you can test this in test by running MRP. However, in live, it is the setting for the nightly MRP generate. It was mentioned, I believe I wrote that down in slide number 3. Okay, let's go back to my presentation. Okay, now that you've seen it in Plex, let's chat other considerations. The company work calendar, for those of you using UX, this is now called the Material Requirements Work Calendar. This may need to be set up and must be set to more than the sum of the MRP recommendation settings that I covered in slide 4. Honestly, it's best to have this calendar set for at least a year or 2 out. If you are using the transit calendar or material requirements transit calendar, as it's called in UX, it too must be set to more than the sum of the MRP recommendation setting covered in slide 4. Auto MRP does not consider overbuy reductions in the quantity calculations and will cause a discrepancy between the recommendation screen and the created releases. And that is why it is recommended to turn that setting off. If you are using the auto release frozen time fence setting, then you should set the create release day setting to every day for the frozen time fence to be properly considered. This next one should be a very strong consideration. Since for auto MRP to work, the part must already be on a PO that's in a status that shows in the MRP recommendation screen. In most PCNs, as in the example I showed earlier, that is the on order status. Now, you could run into issues where you may potentially have multiple POs in the MRP recommendation screen, perhaps one for your regular orders and one or more for your spot buys. I recommend you consider using blankets in conjunction with the setting auto release prevent non-blanket PO updates. This will cause the auto creation to use blanket POs only, and it will ignore any non-blanket POs. It's important that you remember to communicate changes to your suppliers. Now that the releases are created automatically, it may be easy to forget to communicate. A couple of ways to automatically communicate may be utilizing the supplier portal or perhaps supplier EDI. Before you even consider turning this process on, make sure you understand and trust your current MRP results. If you don't trust the results and you turn this on, you will only make a mess of things, as this will not fix your MRP issues. It'll just automate them. So if you don't trust your MRP results, I recommend you watch some of the older Control+M presents that Patty did on MRP and PRP. And if you still don't trust your MRP, contact us and we can most definitely dissect it with you. Lastly, I can't stress this enough. Before you turn this on in live, make sure you do a series of tests to validate your results. Since this is set at the part level, start with a pilot part and use it for testing and only add more when you feel comfortable. After all, it's easier to fix one part or one PO than a series of them. Lastly, why do it? In a nutshell, simplify your job. This does it for you, and pair it with supplier portal or supplier EDI, and you really do not have much left to do. However, the most common feedback I've received is how by automating even a small percent of parts, frees up time for the purchaser so they may focus on other perhaps troubled parts or suppliers. Okay, this concludes my portion of the session. I will open up the floor to any questions.
Justyna, I'm gonna ask just a few questions before we open things up. First of all, let's talk for just a few minutes about the calendars in the system. So can you go back to your slide that shows all the calendars that are out there?
Right here, these two.
Terrific. Thanks. Now, one of the things you mentioned in here, so this is set up by part and by supplier, right? So we can we want to make sure that the delivery calendars, if we're using them, are set up correctly. And you had mentioned a formula in here. Make sure your calendar is filled out farther than, is it your longest lead time item multiplied by the longest item on the MRP recommendations page? Can you go through that again, that setup?
Yes, for sure. So what it is, so if I'm going to go back to slide number 4, right? So it's the sum of this. So your days, your weeks, and your months will equal to a sum, right? So here, my sum is 3 days plus 3 weeks plus 3 months is really the sum of, well, 3 months, 3 weeks, and 3 days.
So let's say 90 days plus 21 days plus 3 days. So that's what, 114 days, right?
Yeah. So you would want to make sure that your calendar is set up, configured for a minimum of the sum of all of this. Yes.
Okay, so let's talk about those calendars for a few minutes. It's always been my recommendation that, late summer, early fall, you get out there and update all these calendars. What you're saying is, depending on MRP, you might want to do that even, more in advance.
Correct. Yes, I like to make it a standard of being 2 years in advance.
Okay.
Because even though this may seem, 200 and something days or 900 something days, in reality, you'll have it set up for about a year, right? Up to 8 months or so. So it's best to have the 2 years done. So every January or Christmas shutdown, if you have one, and you're setting up do it for 2 years ahead.
Okay, good advice. And for those of you, I'm looking at the names of the companies that are on the call. I know some of you have extremely long lead time parts. You may have your months set out for more than 3 or 4 months. So make sure that those calendars are set up correctly. Now, Justyna, to actually make this happen, let's talk a little bit about the testing. So when we take our clients through the idea of automatically letting MRP generate the releases, a couple settings you mentioned one was not to update non-blanket POs, correct?
Correct.
And those are, let's talk about what a blanket PO is, right? Because you can call a purchase order type a blanket PO, but it's not really a blanket. So now I'm going to put Justyna on, hopefully I won't be putting you too on the spot here, Justyna, but can you show everyone how to tell if something's a real blanket PO with that blanket box on there?
You bet.
Have you got one set up?
I do. I actually have my sample one here.
Beautiful.
Yeah. So this is really all I did, and this is probably what you mean. It's a blanket PO, but it's not really a blanket PO because I'm not necessarily utilizing any of the blanket PO functions, such as a blanket quantity and so on forth. As long as you've got the blanket order number, so this is in the PO detail, I turn this flag on. So let me see, if I turn it off, I don't have the dates. If I turn it on, I just gave it an effective date. I did not give it an expiry date. This is the bare minimum that would be required when utilizing the setting to then ignore regular POs, and then it would only look at the POs with this flag on.
Great, thanks, Justyna. We get that we get that comment all the time about people will say, they're talking about the forecast module, for example, and what they're really talking about is release types of forecast. People might assume that because their blanket or their PO type is called, blanket purchase components, that it is a blanket. So we want to make sure everyone gets that blanket order flag on and has that at least effective date defined in there. Now, this is enabled, Justyna, by a Plex only setting, correct? The actual creation of the releases once we have all of our data set up.
Yes, that is correct.
Okay, so everyone here hopefully knows, I see some folks who are on the call here who've been in Plex a really long time. Plex only settings are able for you to update. You're able to update those and test yourself, just not in live. That's why Justyna is actually working in test today, because she's unable to turn it on in live, and we're not really quite ready to set up our PCN here for ordering materials for us. Heavens forbid someone might actually think it's a real order. I'll end up with $1 million worth of electronics delivered to Justyna's house or something. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen. And again, excuse me. And again, excuse me, communicating that to your suppliers is very important too. So actually sending those out or emailing those POs out. So Justyna, from a testing perspective, would you suggest that every single part that we create automatic releases for gets tested through the test system, or would you test one or two and say, hey, look, as long as these two work out, we're probably pretty good?
Honestly, yeah, as long as you test one or two, but provided you trust the MRP results as it is now manually for every part. The first thing you want to do is you want to make sure you trust your MRP, manual MRP. If you trust it, as long as you test at least one or two parts and test it out and it's working nicely, you're safe to start adding other parts to it.
Great. Let's open up the floor to questions. Remember, if you have a question, hit the mute button. If you're shy and you just want to put something in the chat, I've got the chat open. While we're waiting for questions, I will remind everybody that we do have 2 sessions out on our YouTube channel, and Jill threw the link out there to show you where it is. We've got a bunch of playlists out there. So take a peek out there. One of them is Learning to Love MRP, and another one is Learning to Love PRP. So we'll make sure that'll help you build that trust. Do we have any questions on the call? Pretty quiet group today. All right. Well, Justyna, why don't you go to the next slide here? All right. Our next session is going to be 2 weeks from today, March 6th. It's going to be at noon Eastern, and we're going to have Shannon on our team go over the skills module in Plex. So she's going to talk about skills, associating them with courses, earning skills, controlling what you can do with those skills, and some use cases, some things that we've used skills for in the past or seen customers use skills for. Ooh, Jordy Krall just asked a great question. Justyna, the question was, how do we get to the calendar screen? You want to show Jordy the calendars that we're talking about here?
You bet. Let me just go in here.
So there are multiple, Jordy, while she's bringing this up, there are multiple calendars out there. The most important one to me is a work center calendar because it's capacity plan, but Justyna's got another one here she care about.
So the 2 that I mentioned are the Material Requirements Transit Calendar in Classic. That's called the Transit Calendar. And the other one was the Material Requirements Work Calendar, which in Classic, that is your work calendar.
And the difference between those 2 again?
This is when you actually ship to the supplier, and this is when you're essentially working for, yeah. And
those are both specific to MRP calculations? They're not driving anything else? Okay. Great. Justyna, could you click on the Work Center calendar just for a minute?
You bet.
Thank you. In case anyone isn't familiar with this, grab any Work Center if you would. Make sure you take the time to keep this guy up to date. This is your tip on how to keep your capacity plan and scheduling working. So if Justyna looks here, we're working every day in the month of February, 3 shifts a day. To edit this, if you just scroll down, so you can see we got our shift hours and our shutdown here. We can actually add an override, the shift override here. And we could add work or take it away. And again, we can do it for one work center, everything in a building, a whole group, etc. And David just asked, are those calendars named something different in Classic? They certainly are. Justyna, you said one was called the work calendar and the other one's called the transit calendar, right?
That is correct. Yeah.
Do you have the
Sorry.
two names on your slide deck?
I do. Yeah, and I was just
Beautiful.
trying to actually show that, but apparently I minimized it instead. I apologize. Here we go. So in Classic, it's called the company work calendar. So that's for the materials requirements work calendar in UX. And in Classic, that's the transit days calendar versus material requirements transit calendar in UX.
Beautiful. Beautiful. All right. Any other questions? All right. I'm going to thank everyone for coming. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Thanks, Justyna. Great job. Our next Control+M Presents will be in 2 weeks, where we'll be talking about skills tracking. Our Shannon Hadley will be speaking on how to set up the skills and training modules in Plex. We're going to talk about connecting skills and courses, as well as leveraging the skills matrix to see where we're short and need to run training, and some cool use cases. We've got some customers who've used skills for kind of interesting things, so it'll be fun to see that. We'll be sending out invites within the next couple of days, and please don't forget to check out our YouTube. Like everybody else, we like our thumbs up and likes, so share this news with everyone you work with and everybody you know in the Plex community. Thanks again, everybody.